in Barcelona it's still afternoon, in the rest of Europe might be evening. Thank you for coming today to this conference organized by eBay in the framework of the program Aula Mediterránea. We are very happy at eBay to host today Dr. May Darwish. She's senior lecturer in international relations of the Middle East at the University of Birmingham. She's probably one of the persons that has been studying more the state behavior in the Middle East within international relations debates. She has plenty of research published in renowned journals, Foreign Policy Analysis, the Journal of Global Security Studies, Democratization, Mediterranean Politics, Global Discourse, and she has edited and participated in several volumes of international relations of the Middle East. You might find several of her publications available: Threats and Alliances in the Middle East, Saudi and Syrian Policies in a Turbulent Region in 2019, but also Foreign Policy of Armed Non-State Actors, which is, I think, coming, and also other books on the view from Riyadh, a neoclassical realist perspective of Saudi foreign policy towards Iran in the post-2011 Middle East. Today we are going to listen to her to talking about the state behavior and evolution, the threats and challenges after 2011. I mean, it has been almost a decade that has been very quick for some of us, very slow for the younger generations. This is something that I realize every time I get into a class, that, I mean, for me, it's a very short time, for them it's a very long time. But it's interesting to have a moment to think and to reflect on in which state the region is today. So I really thank you for accepting our invitation. I thank Iemet and Elisabetta for all her work in Aula Mediterránea, and all of you for joining us today here, and all those that are also joining us online. So, with no more further ado, Professor Darwish, you've got the floor. After her conference, we will have some time for Q&A, so it will be your turn to participate as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. It's a delight to be here and to be presenting parts of my research. I also would like to thank the organizers. There was a lot of work to bring me here today, so I'm very grateful, and I'm very looking forward to discuss the topics of alliances with you today. So, as Lourdes mentioned, it's a moment of reflections, and that's exactly what I'm going to be presenting today. It's more about reflections on the questions of threats and alliances in the region. I'm not going to be giving you lots of answers, but actually you will be leaving today with more questions and more puzzles to try and find out the answers for. But before starting, before starting, I would like to give you a little bit of background of where my research interests are, why I'm interested in those questions. So my main interest is really on the questions of international relations of the Middle East. Nowadays, there is a lot of focus on questions of authoritarianism, repression, what's happening inside the states in the region. But there hasn't been a lot of reflection and less study by the day on the international relations aspect of the region. Why? It's just somehow it hasn't been drawing much attention among scholars in the last decade. But still, I think there are still a few scholars and a group of scholars who are still more interested in some of these questions. And I think my research interest is more speaking to questions of what shapes states' behavior in the region, what drives their decisions. Is it mainly driven by material consideration? Is it driven by identity? Is it both? How identity is coming to shape some of these decisions? And I worked more specifically on Saudi foreign policy, how questions of Islam, the interpretation of Islam in the kingdom has shaped Saudi foreign policy, but also conflict in the region, how to understand some of the conflict dynamics. And finally, and that's one of my latest projects, I've been more interested in cross-regional links between the Middle East and East Africa, and how some of the conflicts and the tensions in the Middle East has been transferred to other regions like the Horn of Africa. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss this later on, but this is very broadly where I'm coming from. So today, I'm going to be more talking specifically about why the questions of alliances is puzzling in the Middle East. It's been very much known in the literature that it's an outlier case. It's usually one of the most complex regions where alliances just don't make sense. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what is this puzzle exactly, why is it puzzling. I'm going to also mention some of the theoretical approaches that has been used to study some of these puzzles, some of these questions. I'm not going to delve too much into the details, but I'm happy to answer more questions in the end. But what I'm going to show you more is how these theoretical frameworks help us understand the main patterns of alliances in the region. And I will give you a little bit of overview of these alliances, but as I move on, I'm going to be bringing some of these theoretical questions, some of these theoretical reflections on each of these patterns. And finally, I would like to talk a little bit about the current and recent state of alliances in the region and how to make sense of some of the patterns that we see nowadays. So, before starting, you might have all followed the news the last few weeks on the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement and the signs of some sort of cooperation that has been mediated by China, which is, again, a very interesting development in the region. But when you follow the news, you will find that most of the responses to this event has been, oh, this is something that is going to change the Middle East. This is something new. We haven't seen this before. Or the other response saying, well, this is not going to change. It's just a moment, and Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to go back to where they were before, and the rule in the Middle East that nothing changes. The reality is always in between these two extremes. It's never like everything is going to change, and it's never also that nothing changed. There's always something that changes, and there's a very nice quotation by Fred Halliday when he commented on 9/11. He said exactly that. Every big event in international relations, there's always these kind of responses that sometimes we just try or somehow we overlook the interesting questions because we try to generalize. And that's exactly how most of the studies of alliances in the Middle East, when you look at the press, that's how they try to somehow make sense of these. Today, I'm going to try to do something a little bit different and rather offer you a perspective, not an answer to the question, not a definitive reality of what is going to happen in the Saudi-Iranian case, but rather a framework of how to understand this particular event, put it in a larger context, but also use some of the tools that I'm going to talk about to understand other alliances in the region. So, how to make sense of this? Usually, many of the scholars who looked at alliances in the region, they're often struck by how complex it is. And even many take some sort of joy in drawing some of these charts, patterns. If you go on this map online, on the browser, if you press on any of these actors, you will see the kind of alliances that they have with other actors in the region. And then you can start appreciating the complexity of how some alliances don't make sense because some friends, they just have completely different enemies or they make completely different alliance choices and so on and so forth. To add even another layer of complexity that we're not just dealing with states, we're also dealing with non-state actors who are definitely also making alliances at regional and international level, and these alliances can be as significant as state alliances as well. So, in a way, how to make sense of this complexity? Again, from the first sight, you might realize that this is very random, it doesn't make sense, but actually it does make sense. And the puzzle needs to be divided into some questions and some aspect. We cannot understand everything But there are some questions that many of the scholars got interested when they looked at these puzzles. First, why alliances form? Why particular alliances emerge at certain moments, at certain episodes of history? Are they driven by power? Are they driven by threat, by profit, or other reasons? So there is a big debate, a big question, understanding first why these alliances emerge in the first place. The second question, how states come to choose their enemies and their friends, because alliances are not just two states come together, it's also a decision on each side of choosing a friend and an enemy, how to perceive another actor either as a friend or as an enemy. More importantly, why some alliances, when they are formed, they actually last a bit longer than others. Why some alliances, after forming, they might just last 1 year, and other might last 30 or 40 years. And there are many, many examples of these striking differences in the Middle East. But again, that's a totally different question, but it also adds a little bit part to understanding that bigger picture. And finally, the question that I would like to reflect on, and I would like you also to reflect on as you study the Middle East, but also other regions, to what extent those alliance patterns are exceptional. Are they unique? Is the Middle East really an outlier case? Is it a case that IR theories cannot explain or not? And that's a question that I'm going to come back to in the end. But mainly somehow, as I move on, I will be talking about these different questions. But it's really important to note that every question of these is forming part of the bigger picture. And to understand the bigger picture, we need to dissociate these questions. To understand a bigger reality, a complex reality, we just need to break it down. And somehow these are the main questions that I'm going to be breaking down those alliances in the Middle East. So when we look at the literature, you will find that the IR literature, and mainly IR scholars, found in the Middle East an interesting field to test their alliance theories. So the main alliance theories that were formed over the years, somehow IR scholars developed these theories based on understanding of alliances in Europe or elsewhere, and somehow to test the validity, they chose the Middle East as a tough case, as a tough region. And basically, if their theories work in the Middle East, it means it can work elsewhere. And you will find that somehow they're divided between two extremes. The first extreme, looking at these alliance patterns from a realist perspective, looking mainly at drivers based on military capabilities, on how states accumulate power or seek security through these alliances. And basically, they assume that states are rational actors. They make decisions based on these rational actors. And that is generally portrayed in the book of Stephen Wall, The Origins of Alliances, which is a seminal book on alliances in the Middle East. And he tested his theory, his balance of threat theory, on the Middle East, providing a picture of the region where perception of threats are the main drivers of alliances. On the other extreme, you'll find the constructivist scholars, like Michael Barnett, who talked more about questions of identity, saying, well, looking just at threats as synonymous of material factors is not really covering the main reality of what's happening in the region. We need to look at identity. We need to look sometimes at alliances that just don't make sense from a realist perspective, but rather they're driven by identity. They're driven by other non-material factors. And he offered a view of alliances in the region from that perspective. So how Arabism, for example, was like a divisive force in the Arab world, the development of Arabism, how the development of Arabism was somehow also shaping alliance politics in the region. Most of the scholars nowadays, they look at these two extremes and say, well, it's not black and white. It's actually much more complicated than this. And in every alliance decisions, we have identities and we have power. And therefore, many scholars, including myself, were trying to find an understanding of alliance making that is taking into account both the material side and the ideational side, and trying to devise an understanding that takes into account both factors because they're both present, they're both playing a part in every alliance decision. So a little bit more details about these two extremes. Neorealism, you will see that Walt, for example, identified 4 main factors that drive threat perception: geographic proximity, aggregate power, offensive power, and aggressive intentions. So, in his perspective, states would identify a threat based on the geographic proximity, whether their neighbor or like a power that's very close to them geographically is having or is accumulating power, accumulating military power, economic power. And this power has to be offensive. It's not a defensive power. It's actually showing that there is an offensive element to it. And at the same time, there are aggressive intentions. So looking at that, you could see, for example, that Iraq in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 80s, was somehow fitting that perspective. It was fitting for many of the Gulf countries that it's a country geographically close to many of the small Gulf countries. It's accumulating power. Saddam Hussein managed to double the military capabilities of Iraq between 1975 and 1979, and also an offensive power that has ambition to control the region. And Saddam Hussein as well showed aggressive intentions. Nevertheless, many of the Gulf countries did not perceive Saddam Hussein as the main source of the threat. It was rather the Islamic Revolution that happened in Iran in 1979 that was the main source of the threat for many of the Gulf states. And therefore, they supported Saddam Hussein in the longest war in the region, which is the Iran-Iraq war from 1980 until 1988 against Iran. So you have here a very strong challenge to what Walt is arguing, that many of these alliance decisions did not really fit that realist perspective, because even though there was all the elements present in Iraq, somehow the neighbors of Iraq did not really perceive it as the main source of the threat. Later on, after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, it became very clear that Saddam Hussein can be a threat to the Gulf countries. But before that, the alliance decision that was made then was not necessarily based on that realist perspective. The constructivists offer a different perspective, saying, well, it's about the identity. It's about the fact that sometimes identity is shaping alliance decisions. It's about how identity is shaping a certain worldview, and based on that worldview, states and actors come to understand where their interests lie. Again, I'll give you another exception to that. Iraq and Syria in the 1970s, they were the worst of enemies. Both they were governed by the Ba'athist ideology. Both had a pan-Arab agenda, and both had more or less the same identity. Nevertheless, they couldn't be in agreement on anything in the region. So again here, the identity and the similarity in this identity was rather a divisive force. Another example, Saudi Arabia, which is having an Islamic interpretation of its identity, again, over the history, have perceived many Islamic or political Islam movements as the source of threats, not necessarily as potential allies. So again, identity here as well is presenting lots of problems. So bearing in mind that these are the two main theoretical explanations, other scholars started looking at these two and trying to find an answer to some of these puzzles. How to make sense of these exceptions. Why in some cases alliances are made based on realist perspective, and in other cases identity seems to be the main driver of these sort of alliances. And somehow they started to build a better understanding of how alliances are shaped in the region. But to add even more complexity, that there are many cases of alliances that they might not be driven by identity per se or realist perspective, they may be driven by domestic consideration, by some factors that actually lie inside the state. It might be the fact or domestic vulnerability that became somehow at the intersection of an international event. So transnational identities, for example, here provided this source of threat. So the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, it inspired lots of opposition movements across the region to overthrow their autocratic governments. Saddam Hussein, in his justification of the war, that Iran somehow presented that sort of instability, that it might have threatened the stability of Iraq. Many of the Shia communities were blamed, or they were even sometimes portrayed as they would support Iran in case of a war, which, by the way, did not really happen during the Iran-Iraq war, but it was a perception. It was a sort of domestic vulnerability. Also, other factors like omnibalancing, which is an interesting concept, that many of the autocratic regimes in the region, somehow their main priority is to survive. So it's not the interest of the state that they are seeking through these alliances, it's rather the interest of the regime and the survival of the regime. So they would make international alliances that would help them survive domestically, like Egypt alliance with the US after the 1975 period, and many other sort of dynamics. And you could already see many of these omnibalancing dynamics nowadays, how authoritarian regimes make international alliances because it would simply help them survive domestically. Economic factors as well can be source of alliances, and there were interesting, like the prototype cases of that, again, Egypt and Jordan, where many of the foreign policy decisions and alliances were somehow driven by economic consideration at the domestic level. If you look now at Egypt's foreign policy, it's very interesting during that economic crisis how Egypt is trying to navigate regional and international dynamics, but to serve its economic situation at the inside. So again, here you will find that alliance decisions are used for domestic and driven by domestic purposes. Finally, there is a big question whether regime types matter. When we study alliances of monarchies, does it matter, or is it different from alliances that are taken or made by republics, for example, in the region? Some scholars say yes, that regime types matter. Monarchies tend to ally with similar regime types, that there is some sort of solidarity between some types of regimes in the Middle East, and that may be driving some of the alliances in the region. So here, I gave you a very, very quick overview of the main theoretical considerations here of what is driving those alliances, what could be the different variables and the different factors that drove different alliance decisions in the region. It doesn't mean that it's always one explanation that's correct. It doesn't mean that there is one truth out there about alliances, but these are rather offering different lenses, different worldviews to understand a part of these alliance phenomenon in the Middle East. So moving on, I would like to take you a little bit on this journey of looking at the main alliance patterns in the Middle East, but also reflecting on these using some of these theoretical lenses that I've just mentioned. So I'm going to very, very briefly talk you through the main patterns of alliances that happened in the Middle East. These alliances are not by any means comprehensive of all alliance decisions and patterns in the region, but they definitely shaped the international relations of the region. I will also show you that some of the recent developments that we see nowadays in the Middle East, they're actually finding their roots in some of these patterns over the decades. So the first episode started with what has been called the Arab Cold War. The Arab Cold War is bearing a bit of similarity with the Cold War, but it's a bit different. So even though they were both happening at the same time, mostly around the 1950s and 60s, the Arab Cold War was rather a war in the Arab world between two types of regime, between the monarchies and the republics. And at that time, during the 1950s and 60s, there was this moment of decolonization in the Middle East, the emergence of new states, but also some coups d'etats and revolutions taking place, overthrowing many of the regimes that were put in place by colonial powers. And that started somehow in Egypt, in Syria, followed in Iraq and in Libya, and many of these coups d'etat and revolutions took somehow the region as a pattern. It's a pattern of overthrowing some of the monarchies that somehow had privilege and alliances with many of Western powers and established instead republics based on a version of socialism. And obviously many allied with the USSR, and their main narrative was constantly challenging imperialism, challenging the West, challenging Great Britain and France and their role in the Middle East. Obviously, some monarchies survived this pattern, namely the monarchies in the Gulf, and to an extent they formed an alliance. They formed an alliance to, in a way, stand in the face of these coups d'etats and revolutions in the region. Obviously, the republics were considered revisionist, revolutionary, and they were led by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who sort of established his leadership around this agenda and a leadership for Egypt as well in Arab politics. That also was the beginning of Pan-Arabism. This leadership did not just come with this revolutionary idea, but these revolutionary principles were knitted with a pan-Arab dynamic, that colonialism divided the region into small states, but the reality that the region all belonged to one Arab state. And the goal was to unify the Arabs against imperialism, against Israel, and achieve some sort of independence from modern imperialism. Obviously, these alliances, again, they were driven by some identity, which is Pan-Arabism, but also driven by some material factors, driven by a war against Israel, driven by a survival. Some of these monarchies were looking for survival, and also many of the revolutionary regimes and the revisionist regimes, they were also looking for legitimacy to survive. They were looking for a regional project that would support their survival in the region. So obviously you can find here that the Arab world was divided between these two blocks. Again, there was no direct war, but there were constant tensions and also indirect wars and proxies. And the major war that happened was the North Yemen War, where Egypt fought directly and Saudi Arabia through proxies in Yemen for 5 years. But somehow this Arab Cold War shaped alliances in the Middle East. Again, even though pan-Arabism was that main driver of alliances, it was also divisive, and it created this rift between these two groups. In the Arab-Israeli conflict, there was a different dynamic. There were Arabs against US and Israel. So even though the monarchies, for example, they were supported by the US in general, when it came to the Arab-Israeli conflict, the dynamic changed and the alliance changed. So it's really important here to know that some of the alliances that are taken for granted, they're not really that simple, and they're also full of contradictions, like the US relationship with many of the Gulf countries. It's not a partnership, it's an alliance that had its tension, it had its periods of ups and downs, and also it's not on all issues, it's on certain issues in the region. And that's, again, a good example of that. Moving on to the next period. When Egypt decided to give up the leadership of pan-Arabism in the region. After 1967, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and part of Palestine, they were attacked by Israel, and they all lost part of its land. And 1967 was a big shock to pan-Arabism, a big shock to Gamal Abdel Nasser and his leadership project in the region. And to an extent, it changed the dynamics of alliances. Because again, the Arab Cold War, it's not even a division between the Arabs, it's now all Arabs against Israel and the US. Nevertheless, when there was a war in 1973, and Egypt, Syria, they both fought against Israel, once the war ended, the alliances collapsed. And again, Arab divisions started to play and kick in the region. And obviously, it was about how to deal with Israel, how to solve the situation. Obviously, many of the Arab countries were in the view of, well, we continue fighting, we continue the war effort against Israel. Egypt was somehow unwilling to play the role of leadership any longer. There was a change of presidency. There was Gamal Abdel Nasser died and Anwar Sadat came to power, and he just didn't believe that this project was viable anymore. But Egypt needed to change its foreign policy, needed to adopt a more practical, a more nationalist identity. And here you could see how the identity was crucial, that the change in the identity in Egypt was a direct factor that contributed to how Egypt viewed its interests and also made decisions based on that interest. So before 1967, Egypt, with its pan-Arab project, it was all about pan-Arabism, it's about Palestine, it's about fighting as Arabs against Israel. After 1973, it's about Egypt first. It's about Egypt national interest. And based on that, Anwar Sadat decided to pursue a peace treaty with Israel that created a rift in the Arab world where most of the Arabs against Egypt. So again here, the alliance completely shifted and changed, not just within the Arab world, but also in the dynamic of the Arab-Israeli conflict. So you could see here how the Arab world again became divided and changing very quickly. Somehow Syria, in that episode, it's really important because Syria was somehow in the Arab-Israeli conflict always considering Egypt its main ally. It cannot fight Israel without Egypt. And to an extent, Egypt's decision to pursue the peace treaty meant that Syria was totally isolated. It's in a very, very tough position where the balance of power, it's not really in its favor, and they have to survive. It's again a realist view of how to understand Syria's position. So in a very, very short-lived attempt, Syria started looking for a different ally, looking for an alternative. The first obvious option was Iraq. And there was a very short-lived rapprochement between Syria and Iraq between 78 and 79, which obviously did not last because of the ideological war between the two Ba'ath parties in both countries. But it was mainly the moment that Syria realized that they needed to find an ally, which led to somehow the second pattern, or one of the most important alliances in the region that developed after the Islamic Revolution. In 1979, for anyone studying the international relations of the Middle East, it's the year that changed the region. Actually, it really changed many of its patterns. 1979, there was the Islamic Revolution, there was the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, and also there was the USSR invasion of Afghanistan and the change of the role of the USSR in the Middle East. And to an extent, 1979 created that imbalance, but also created opportunities. Iran, which was one of the main allies of the US in the region, all of a sudden had a change of regime that's very hostile to the US, but also having this anti-imperialist ideology. At the same time, Syria saw this as a great opportunity to find another ally in its fight against Israel. Egypt is out of the question. Iraq, the ideological differences does not allow it to play that role. And Syria decided that Iran, or the Iranian Revolution, was a gift to survive that environment. And obviously, the Islamic Revolution created different responses in the region. Perceived as a threat in Iraq, also perceived as a threat in the Gulf, but perceived as an opportunity in Syria, perceived as an opportunity in Palestine. And somehow that is another divider of the region. Before 1979, the main actor that created division or somehow created the patterns of alliances was Israel as the main threat in the Arab world. After 1979, it became Iran, and very slowly it started changing even the patterns of alliances within the Arab-Israeli conflict. So after 1979, you find the Arabs divided between states supporting Iraq against Iran, and states actually supporting or just staying silent for what's happening in Iran. And obviously, this is one of the most enduring alliance patterns that stayed until today. So remember the question when we talked about why some alliances survived, why some alliances didn't survive. You could see here the contrast. The alliance between Syria and Iraq survived a year maximum. This alliance survived nearly 40 years now, or even more. So again, this is a very, very important question. Why this particular alliance in a region where alliances are constantly changing, why this is an alliance that survived for decades? So somehow 1979 was that breaking point. Another breaking point in the region was the Iraq War of 2003. But before then as well, there was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990 and the war in 1991, where Iraq again was somehow making another big mistake in the region that created another type of imbalance. The Cold War was ending, the US became the hegemon in the Middle East, and that had a huge impact on alliances. In 2003, that became even more confirmed with the US invasion of Iraq, and it became very clear that the US is the hegemon. There is no other balance. And you can see afterwards many cases of omni-balancing, where many actors align with the US to profit from that situation. So in a way, the 2003 was an important moment. But afterwards, we will see the rise of non-state actors as main alliance-making actors in the region. The breaking down of Iraq, but also the fact that many of the Arab states are not supporting the resistance. The Arab-Israeli conflict has been going down the peace of negotiations and mediations supported by the US after 1990, many non-state actors realized that the states are not representing their interests. They're not representing the reality. So Hamas, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon, started acting as international actor, as regional actor, making alliances at the regional level. And again, based on the same patterns that evolved after 1979, after 2003, these patterns became consolidated. So the axis of Iran, Syria, became even supported by Hezbollah and Hamas, who joined the axis as main actors in these alliances. And somehow, on the other hand, there were states, status quo states, that still perceived Iran as a threat, allies of the US, unwilling to change these patterns and unwilling to take any military actions against Israel, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. After 2011, again, many of the scholars look at 2011 as a breaking point in the Middle East. It may be true at domestic level. It created some sort of rifts. It created waves of change at domestic level, not necessarily in the right direction, but somehow it was more a domestic event in that sense. Even though it created lots of civil wars in the Middle East, it created the breaking down of states. But when it comes to the international relations of the region, it came to consolidate the existing patterns that emerged before 2011. That somehow we've seen the same alliances after 1979, they became even more consolidated, some changes here and there, but it's the same pattern. The rise of more non-state actors like ISIS, other non-state actors that played a big, big role in the international relations of the Middle East, but also the breaking down of some of the states, like Syria, created some dynamics around that. But at the same time, they were again alongside the same alliance patterns that existed. So the example for Syria, you will see that what was called the status quo powers, or the powers that were more or less supportive of the US, they became more anti-Bashar. They looked at somehow the Arab uprising as an opportunity to get rid of Bashar al-Assad, an opportunity to actually break that 4-decade axis between Syria and Iran and isolate Iran in the region. So for a very long time, Iran was perceived as a threat, and all of a sudden, the main ally of Iran is in crisis. So of course, all of the Arab, or most of the Arab countries, considered that as an opportunity to weaken Iran in the region, and took that as an opportunity to bring down the regime of Bashar al-Assad, including Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and many other countries like Turkey and the US. Obviously, it became very clear that all of these actors don't have the same agenda, even though they're all joined in the same alliance, but they're not necessarily doing the same thing in Syria, and they're not necessarily following the same goals or even the same strategies or supporting the same allies. So even though they're allied, but inside they're just having a lot of room and a lot of independence inside of these alliances. At the same time, the allies of Iran, like Hezbollah, and the allies of Syria, Iran, Hezbollah, they started actually intervening in Syria. Looking at this not just as an opportunity, it's not an opportunity, it's actually a threat to their survival. It's quite an existential threat that if the regime of Bashar al-Assad is down, Hezbollah would have a problem to survive in Lebanon. Iran would be further isolated at the regional level, especially with the international sanctions. And for them, they wouldn't even take a chance of letting the regime of Bashar al-Assad go down. So here we have, again, the same alliance that existed before, but along different lines. Hamas took a different turn. And it's, again, a very interesting and very puzzling case of a non-state actor, where it said at the very beginning of the uprising, we're unable to support of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. It cut off ties with Iran and started seeking alliances again in the conservative bloc of the Arab countries of Saudi Arabia, Syria. If you follow the news a little bit closely, the last 5 years, Hamas has been trying to go back to the Iran-Syria alliance again. So here's another puzzle, another example of an alliance that survived breaking down and going back to where it was before. So after 2011, more complexity came as the US was not necessarily interested to play a role in the Middle East. The hegemonic policies that the US pursued after 1991, and especially after the cost of the Iraq War after 2003, the Obama administration came to the conclusion that the US has no good staying in the Middle East, and somehow it's time to decrease its effort, decrease its presence, and decrease its spending in the region, and rather let its allies sort their problems on their own without much support from the US. Obviously, this was a message, not necessarily something that meant that the US, for example, is decreasing its military bases. That never happened, or decreasing its spending or its military support of some of the Gulf countries, or even its arms sale. Nothing like that changed. But here, to give you an idea of how ideas and perceptions were crucial, once Obama started announcing and making speeches about this hegemonic retreat from the Middle East, it already gave signals to many of its allies in the region that they have to rely on themselves, they have to follow their own interest, and that unleashed a lot of domestic military buildup in the Gulf, a lot of policies, aggressive policies in the Gulf, that it's time to rely on ourselves. It's time to follow our own agenda. The US is not going to intervene in Syria. The US is not going to help us. We have to pursue our own interest. And somehow here, this became one of the main dynamics that shaped the post-2011 regional order, that there is no hegemonic presence. Even though the US may be hegemonic in material terms, its hegemony, it's not accepted and it's not perceived as such by domestic actors in the region and regional actors equally. And you can see that in the Syria crisis, in Yemen, in Libya, where different actors, even though they know they're allies of the US and they know what the US is doing in these instances, they're actually deviating from that and following their own agenda and their own policies on that. Looking at the policies of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, very striking illustrations of that dynamic. But also, these countries don't agree among themselves. Even though from the outside it may seem all that they're supporting the same actor, they're pursuing the same policies, they're taking the same sides in this regional conflict, inside of this conflict there are tensions. Inside Syria, Qatar is competing with Saudi Arabia on whom to support, what actors to fund. They're also competing inside Yemen. Now the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they're not really agreeing on what to do in Yemen. So you could see as well how these alliances from the inside, they're also breaking down, but there's still something that hangs them together. It's still staying there. Finally, after 2011, another interesting development, which is the Abraham Accords in 2020, which again is changing the dynamics. And now there has been lots of talks about possibility of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel as well, being negotiated secretly. There are rumors, but they're indicative of a certain patterns of policies around the Arab-Israeli conflict. So you could see as well some of these patterns are changing, but again, even though there is change, there are still things which are there and they're somehow constant, and some things are changing. So not everything is really changing in the Middle East. So some theoretical reflections on some of these patterns here. Definitely, when looking at all of these examples and all of these patterns, it becomes very clear that adopting either an ideational or a material lens does not really fully capture the complexity and the richness of the cases of alliances in the region. Definitely, that's why many actors look for these eclectic frameworks. They're trying to sort how to combine ideational and material, because many of these examples and puzzles that I've given you, they're also kind of just example. There are many, many more puzzles and patterns where they just don't fit the mold of these theories. But also, these patterns over time, they can give us a picture of how the physical structure of the region changed, how the region changed from an Egyptian leadership, a region that has been mainly focused on anti-imperialism, decolonization, to more fighting the Islamic Revolution and Islamism and Israel, and now onto non-state actors and the rise and the breakdown of many of the states in the region. So you could see here that the physical structure of the region is also evolving and changing over time. But also there is a change in the symbolic structure. The overarching ideas in the 1950s and 60s, pan-Arabism was the overarching narrative and norm. Afterwards, it became pan-Islamism with the Islamic Revolution and the rise of many pan-Islamic movements in the region. Afterwards, we started talking about sectarianism, the divides between Sunnis and Shias. So there are somehow an evolution of that symbolic structure as well. Finally, factors of alliance formation, why certain alliances emerge, they are not necessarily the same as to why alliances last or endure or collapse. Again, think of the example of Syria and Iraq. Maybe the driver of that very, very brief alliance was the need for security, the need for a survival mechanism in the Arab-Israeli conflict for Syria. But somehow it didn't survive because the factors that would lead an alliance to be consolidated didn't really exist in that case. A very important pattern that even though it may seem from the outside that many of the Arab states after 2011 are very strong, they're very powerful, they have a total control over their societies through repression, through violence. When it comes to the international and the regional level, the pattern that we're seeing is actually the decline of the state. It's the decline of the state ability to act regionally and internationally in the face of non-state actors. So that's, again, a contradiction, a big question for you to reflect on. There are no answers today, but it's more reflections. Finally, maybe you would have thought, what about liberalism? We've talked about realism, we've talked about constructivism, we've talked about domestic politics. Where's the mainstream liberalism in IR? So again, this is something that many scholars didn't even think about exploring in the Middle East, that it doesn't work. Well, you know, states just don't cooperate because there are economic benefits. But actually, there are some interesting cases for liberalism. Most of the international organizations like the Arab League, the GCC have failed. And that kind of prompted many discussions that maybe neoliberalism doesn't really work. The idea of having institutions, international regimes to build these types of cooperation, interdependence, and eventually would prevent states from going to conflict. It didn't really happen in the Middle East. It didn't work. But do we really give up on liberalism? It's an open question. So final words. As you can see, there is really wide disagreement on how to understand and explain alliances in the region. These theoretical approaches are not mutually exclusive. If you adopt a realist perspective, or if you adopt a realist explanation, it doesn't mean that constructivism doesn't work. It's always like looking at a statue, and each lens is giving you a perspective on that statue, like a statue in the middle, one person is standing in that corner, one person is standing in the other corner. Every person will be describing the statue from their own perspective, and that's exactly how these lenses work. Every lens is focusing on a certain aspect of the reality. They break it down to be able to explain it, but it doesn't mean that there's only one truth to alliances in the region. Finally, somehow alliances, as you can see, they're very ephemeral. Many of them don't last too long, sometimes even a few months. Personal, individualistic, and opaque. The decision-making around them is very, very opaque, and it's not very transparent. And therefore, it's very hard sometimes to study alliances, but nevertheless, we have still some tools to make sense of many of these puzzles. And I hope today that I've given you some of these tools to reflect on, but I think I've taken more than I should. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any of the questions. You didn't stop me. You didn't stop me.
No, because I was super interested. By the way, yeah. I would have allowed you to talk about 1 hour more, probably, and keep on taking notes like crazy. So now it's time for Q&A. So now it's time for doubts, comments, curiosities, questions. Yes. Okay, we have a brave one here.
Thank you for your presence, for this very informative presentation. My question would be...
I think they are bringing you a mic.
Oh, thank you. So my question is, if Erdogan in Turkey somehow loses the election in next May, how would you expect Turkey's approach to Syria, to the war in Libya, and its alliance with Qatar to change in this new context? Thank you.
What's your name?
Luay. Yeah, thank you.
Any other question? Maybe we could gather some questions. Yeah, the gentleman in the front.
My name is Jordi Vilanova. Bit left field here, going towards sociology rather than international relations. If we look at the intersect between geopolitics and history, we'll see that if we go back beyond 1958 and pan-Arab nationalism, we'll see that, and we go back to the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire, we'll see that these states, the modern states, are constructs of the Western powers. And most of society, Arab society, was made up of tribes, a very tribal society, especially on the peninsula. And we can see that now in Yemen and in Somalia and Somaliland. How far do you think that that has an effect on Arab societies, in plural, rather than state actors? You know, drill down to society and what the culture is nearer the people.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes.
Okay, my name is Marta. Regarding the newest Iranian revolution and all the riots that have been happening during the last month, what do you think that it has an effect on the alliance of the Gulf area, or it just has remained as a national issue, such as the 2011 revolutions?
Can you just clarify, what do you mean by, you want to know a little bit about the recent developments?
Yes.
Okay.
Like
Saudi Arabia and Iran, the rappers, or you're talking about the Iranian unrest?
The Iranian. Yeah.
Yes, okay.
So maybe we can go for this set of questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the question, Luay. Thank you for the questions about Turkey. I always tell my students, we don't do predictions. we're social scientists. Don't give us more than we actually can do. So on predictions, I mean, I give you the example of the Cold War. Scholars in the US, they were divided that the Cold War is going to end with either like a confrontation between the US and the USSR, and some saying, well, no, there will be no confrontation and the Cold War is going to last. And somehow the Cold War ended peacefully, and no one predicted that. So I think we have to stop making those predictions because we don't necessarily have the data. But what we can, I mean, if you want to look at your question, what happens if Erdogan loses the election? We know from previous cases that change in leadership may lead to a change in foreign policy. But what kind of change in foreign policy? Again, assuming that everything will change or assuming that nothing will change is two extremes. And the reality probably is going to be in the middle. So whoever is going to come after Erdogan, they can't break away with Turkey's foreign policy that has been conducted for a decade now on Syria or with Qatar. But they will also make some changes. Some in very rare historical incidents, some leaders made significant changes to their country's foreign policy. The example that we talked about today is Anwar al-Sadat in Egypt. The same is Ishaq Rabin in Israel, and both kind of paid with their life the cost of that drastic change in foreign policy. So there are some instances where drastic foreign policies happen, but they're extremely costly. But in most of the cases, change in leadership leads to some change in foreign policy. But the reality is, even if they want to change their foreign policy, there are so many constraints. And that actually may be something I haven't talked about, that sometimes in international relations, identities or power can actually not just act as a driver, they can actually act as a constraint. So in some of these cases, the constraint is usually, you know, where you need to look to understand what's going to happen in Turkey. George, on dismantling the Ottoman Empire and the nature of Arab societies, thank you very much for your question. I think it's really interesting to see how that development from tribal politics to now what we call the modern Arab state. And as much as we don't like the fact that the Arab state is a construct that came to the Middle East from the West, it actually has survived. And even though it's artificial, it doesn't fit the reality of Middle Eastern society. For some reason, the state system in the Middle East, it's still there. Maybe some actors are trying to contest it, like ISIS. Non-state actors, they're still aspiring to become states, so they're not necessarily challenging the concept of the state system itself. So even though we don't like it, there's no alternative. But there is definitely an evolution that happened in many of these Arab states. Many of these tribal politics either lost its significance in high politics or mingled with the high politics, like in Jordan, for example, and how the tribals are very important in Jordanian politics, or in Somalia and Somaliland, where the clans, I mean, they don't call it tribes, they call it clans, are also very influential of how the government is run. And also there are some other cases where the tribes took a backstage, like in Saudi Arabia, for example, where we see over time how the royal family started really stripping these tribes of their power. Yeah, and their benefits. But the idea is that somehow the national identity over time as well in the Middle East has evolved. So maybe 30 or 40 years ago, many of the people wouldn't identify with the national identity. But nowadays, even in countries which seemed very, very artificial during, you know, the early establishment of the Arab state, now people really do identify with the nation state. So it's still elements of both, and that's what makes you know, somehow the mix in the end interesting. Marta, thank you so much on the question. Yes, the Iranian protest is actually very interesting. I'm not an expert on Iran, so I'm following this from the news. So please forgive my ignorance on that. But it is, I mean, in Iran, we've seen several waves of protests, especially for Iran. The most important wave was 2009. And again, the regime came very hard with repression. And again, this year, we've seen very harsh repression. And to an extent, it's this constant struggle of how to dominate societies and how to control societies, sometimes with violence, sometimes with co-optation. And on the other hand, people, opposition, are still finding ways to contest that control. And it's not just in Iran, it's really everywhere in the Arab world. And again, it's coming from the initial establishment of the state, how the artificial establishment of the state created these sort of realities, but also how many of the policies that were taken by these authoritarian regimes, they were made with the purpose of survival. So in the end, they don't really represent the majority of the interests in their societies. So it is a struggle that's going to continue. Sadly, the Arab uprisings didn't really lead to any progress on that. It's rather the opposite effect. And somehow in Iran, again, very unfortunate to see that even though many of these protests can show you how people aspire for a better future, for more rights, for a more, let's say, open society, somehow the regimes come back even stronger. So that's the authoritarian backlash that we've seen in the region, and what's happening in Iran is no exception.
Okay, Edward.
I think that as for Lourdes, I would have much more questions than the ones I'm able to pose now, but I stick to two of them. One, it's on one peculiar case, which you said puzzling, intriguing. There are two adjectives that I think would fit well, which is Qatar, and how Qatar chooses to align and chooses its friends and foes, as you said. So it's an Arab, conservative, pro-US monarchy, which yet decides to embrace the Arab Spring, embrace the Muslim Brotherhood, and align with an increasingly revisionist Erdogan Turkey. How we can? I mean, which is the explanation that you would give to that? Some people may have said, or would be tempted to say, it's the way of also seeking autonomy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, but in fact what this did was to increase the animosity of Saudi Arabia towards Qatar. So I would like to know also your opinion and assessment on how to best understand the Qatari preferences on alliance formation. And the second is on also, I mean, if we go beyond the limits of the region, and we look also at alliances that have transcended the limits of the region, but which included also partners of the region, we see also that some of them failed miserably, like the Baghdad Pact, and others never even came to exist, like the so-called MESA, the Middle East Strategic Alliances. Also, I would like also if you could add perhaps a little bit of spices here on those aspects, also on the failure of trans-regional formalized alliances. Thanks so much, May. And I think I speak on behalf of all of us because it has been an amazing session.
Yes, Anna.
Thank you. A short question. Is there already an effect in the alliances or patterns of alliances with the introduction of new actors, with this US retreat? Is there any kind of effect with China, with India, with Russia? But yeah, if you see any other foreign actor or external actor also influencing these patterns? Thank you.
Anyone else? No?
I've got
Okay,
3
let's go.
questions.
That's 3 questions already.
Well, Edward, thank you very much for the question. So, yeah, Qatar is a fascinating case. It's a case that you can't even see on the map, and it's caused so much trouble in the last few years. So, but anyway, I think Qatar is a case of, they called it several times, I'm quoting, it's punching above their weight, and it's always trying to play a bigger role. So even though it's been constantly categorized as a small state, it's having ambitions to play a bigger role in the Middle East, playing a more decisive role in Syria, a more decisive role in Libya, in Egypt even, trying to shape outcomes. So one lens to look at is the personality of the leadership and how he, once he took over from his father, he had this ambitious agenda to put Qatar on the world map, and everyone followed the World Cup and how the promotion around the World Cup for Qatar, and it was all part of that. It was all about building that image for Qatar in the international system. And obviously after 2011, not just Qatar, many of the other actors saw the 2011 as an opportunity. It's an opening. Egypt, which has been the biggest and the most influential Arab country, it's in crisis. It has no resources, no interest to play any role at the regional level because it has too many domestic problems. So there was an opening, there was an opportunity. Many of the countries saw this as an opportunity, that it's our moment to take. And I think Qatar was part of that wave. And definitely that created tensions, created competition, because the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, they were all competing over the same thing. They were all competing in Syria, they were all competing in Egypt, they were all competing in Libya. So definitely each of them had their own agenda, which is definitely not reconcilable at some point. So there was conflict, and that's, I think, in a way to understand that, it's really understanding that all of these countries were in a moment of fluidity in the region. They were trying to change their role and change their position in the hierarchy of the region. And that's what's prompted all of these policies. Why the alliances fail, like the trans-regional, the Baghdad Pact, MESA, I think, again, we have to go back to liberalism. Why it didn't work? It's just, again, there are too many differences, but also it's important to remember that many of these initiatives were promoted by external actors to the region. So they did not emerge organically, and that is a problem. So once they didn't emerge organically, they are not reflecting the reality. They are not reflecting genuine interest and genuine cooperation in the region. And that, in my view, is a very strong explanation for why it's not succeeding. It's just the interest is not there for it to survive. Anna, thank you for your question. Definitely, with the US hegemonic retreat, again, it's an announcement that, but it was so important that it made so many signals to regional actors and international actors. China's mediating the Saudi-Iranian rivalry now. It was a shock to everyone. Oh my God, China is actually taking part in this game. Russia is coming back to the Middle East heavily after a decade of nearly no interest, no resources, completely withdrawn from the Middle East. The Syria crisis brought Russia back to the heart of the region. And obviously this, also the fact that the US signaled to many of its partners that it's not going to be supporting, many of even the Gulf countries started showing that the US, that they're talking to Russia, that they're talking to China as a leverage, and showing them, oh, we're going to survive, we're going to have other partners. So I think looking at these pictures in the news are very, very telling of what's, even if we don't know what's happening in these closed rooms, they're extremely telling of how actors are playing the different cards.
Okay, I think that we reached the time. It's time for those who are fasting to go and have some food finally, probably, and for the rest of us to have some time to digest the lecture and keep on enjoying it while we are digesting it. Thank you very much, May. It was a wonderful talk. It was a wonderful approach, and
thank
we really
you for having
appreciate
me.
it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry I went over the time.
No, it was great.